As opposition parties march to the Public Protector's Office demanding the release of the Phala Phala Report, questions are being raised about the pace of investigations into the matter. The Reserve Bank has granted President Cyril Ramaphosa an extension to answer his questions. It's one of the bodies that is currently investigating this matter. And of course, it's been seen a move, by some saying that it's fair, while others say the matter needs to be wrapped up as speedily as possible. Let's speak to Khaya Sithole, an accountant, academic and activist. Khaya, thank you so much for your time this afternoon. An extension granted. You're surprised?
Yeah, look, I think at the crux of it, we have to deliberate on the question of why the president is unable to furnish all these particular law enforcement agencies with the information that they need. So we know that he asked for an extension from the public protector, which was granted, and then they tried to ask for another one again, which was obviously not granted. Same issue with the South African Reserve Bank in that an extension is being sought yet again. The problem with seeking all of these extensions is that it does, unfortunately, give credence to the idea that the president just did not get his ducks in a row in relation to this particular transaction. And it may well be that they're simply making up facts or an audit trail as they go along, hoping that the story checks out. This has grave implications for his credibility and for his standing, because whatever finally or eventually emerges from all these reports, everybody will want to know that, well, if the story is simple, which you hope it is for his own sake, why did it take so long? Why are you demanding extensions if the story is so simple? And if the story isn't simple, then there'll be even more questions about how did you get yourself entangled in such a manner as the first citizen of the country?
I suppose then, listening to what you're saying, it doesn't help the fact that at first we were told this was an auction, and then now again we're seeing a Sudanese businessman, mysterious one. So, as you say, these facts are not helping.
Yeah, and I think the crux of the matter is that in spite of how we came to know about the entire scenario, if the president wants us to believe that this is a regular occurrence at his farm, you'd imagine that there are standard processes and procedures around how currency is handled in cases where currency exchanges hands and how these particular animals eventually get exported to the buyers. In this case, now we know that the money exchanged hands, but the goods did not exchange hands. And it's been more than 2 years since that happened, because he has said that all of this happened around Christmas in 2019. So, of course, if it turns out that the processes underpinning what seems to be a side hustle are so erratic, you do have to question the merits, or rather the wisdom, of the people that the president surrounds himself with, not only on the political advisory front, but also on the very simple matter of how he manages his own businesses.
And a recent article, that I've just alluded to by News 24, that, there's this mysterious Sudanese businessman who paid $580,000 45 days before the theft. It's added another layer to the story, because it means that the dollars were at the farm for 45 days, but the Reserve Bank says you must convert within 30 days. How much of a complication does this all add?
It's a big complication for the president, because first and foremost, we have to acknowledge that the handling of foreign currency, particularly foreign currency of that magnitude, is something that is really overseen by the Reserve Bank through their financial surveillance department. And the first question would have to be, did this businessman, this mysterious businessman, declare that he was coming into the country with so much hard currency? And of course, in his declaration, they would have had to explain exactly what the amount of money was for. So that is the first question that the Reserve Bank will have to explain, whether they were able to find an audit trail of this currency coming into the country. The second question is to then ask the president, well, if you then decided to engage in transactions that involve hard foreign currency, do you understand what the rules are that relate to the handling of that foreign currency? Do you understand what the 30-day rule is about? Because when we say 45 days now, we're only using the 45-day period simply because that's when the money was stolen. It probably could have stayed in his mattress for much longer than that had it not been stolen. So he has to answer very difficult questions around why he actually was breaking the rules relating to how foreign currency is handled and how long foreign currency is to be kept in under one's control. So we are waiting for those particular responses, because it will then give us an insight onto whether the president, who is supposed to be the primary custodian of our laws in the country, whether he himself thinks the laws are optional and probably do not apply to him.
Do you think there could be more questions asked about the fact that why the goods are still not with the owner who has paid, as you alluded to a little earlier on?
Yes, so there's one possibility in that obviously if you and I go to an auction tomorrow, we are gambling. We may get there. Somebody may have more money, so therefore that person may win the auction. So you wouldn't necessarily bring your truck in order to be able to take the goods because you do not know whether you're actually going to be the owner of the goods at the end of the day. So that's the first part. However, once you have obviously emerged as a victor in this particular auction, then there ought to be a process of saying, wait, hold on, I've just passed on my money, $580,000. I need the goods delivered to me. So that would have had to happen within a particular time frame. So the fact that since December 2019, it hasn't happened simply means that we have to question whether there was indeed an underlying transaction to begin with. Because if it turns out that all of this is actually just being used as a ruse or simply as a sham to say that this is the justification for why I had the amount of money, then the president is the one that has to explain that generally when he does transact in game farm, how long does it take for him to export those particular goods, those particular animals to the buyers? And in this case, why has he been comfortable with the fact that he took somebody's money and should have passed on the goods because that is the traditional rules of an exchange transaction, and yet 2 years later, these animals are still stuck in his farm? We need to know from his version how this has come to be, because it suddenly looks like whether you're talking about normal business transactions, this doesn't seem to have followed that pattern. Whether you're talking about foreign exchange control rules, this doesn't seem to have followed the pattern. Whether you're talking about criminal reporting of a crime, this doesn't seem to have followed that pattern. So there is simply far too many departures from what would have been expected had this been a legitimate transaction, had this been the type of theft that the president would have been aggrieved by enough to say, let me report it.
I'm already listening to you and thinking about the questions to ask to all of these bodies that are investigating this particular matter, because we know there's quite a lot of state machinery that is now investigating. But Khaya, there's something that came out this afternoon, and I'm keen to hear your thoughts on it, because the opposition parties were marching to the Office of the Public Protector demanding a release of this particular report. And I was listening to them talk about how they want this, resolved as speedily as possible. But one thing that was said about the Reserve Bank by EFF leader Julius Malema, he said that making a sweeping statement at the Reserve Bank governor saying that he's finding himself, compromised because there's a credit card here that swiped where it wasn't supposed to have been swiped. So maybe that's the reason why this investigation is not moving as speedily as it should. Really, do you think there's more to these allegations, or is it just one of those sweeping statements that the EFF leader is making, and how damaging could it be to this particular investigation?
So we cannot dispute that the opposition political parties have recognized that there's a lot of political mileage associated with how the president essentially keeps scoring own goals and refuses to take himself off the field. So political parties like the EFF, like the IFP, like the DA, were naturally going to firstly not only push for the president to answer questions in parliament, which was a motion that we saw being led unsuccessfully so far by the African Transformation Movement, but also it's simply a matter of, now that the president has found himself in this particular corner, how will the ANC react to it? And we've seen in other opinion pieces and other articles that it is now seen that the ANC has not learned the lessons of the past, where it was seen as protecting its president, in spite of the fact that the MPs serve a dual role in that even though they may be ANC MPs, they actually are responsible for holding the executive accountable. ANC MPs have generally struggled with that, and we're seeing them struggling here again. So in relation to the statements that have been made by Mr. Malema, again, we do know that hyperbole is the type of thing that he doesn't shy away from. So in this particular instance, we'd actually have to see the granular details of these accusations that he's making in order to be able to see whether they are type of transactions, whether they are type of details that are granular enough to have influenced the way that the Reserve Bank is dealing with this particular investigation. My suspicion is that the Reserve Bank, just like all the other organs of state, is simply playing for time, hoping that everybody comes up with conclusions around the same time. You don't want to be the one that says, this is the conclusion that we've reached as a Reserve Bank, only for the public protector to reach a different conclusion, only for the political parliamentary process to reach a different conclusion. So the president's requests for these extensions are not necessarily the type of thing that they hate, because it says to them, well, for as long as he keeps saying that he needs this particular extension, it simply means that there's more information coming, And we don't want to be the first ones to pull the trigger, because quite clearly this is far more complicated than it should have been.
So, Khaya, finally, before we wrap up, I just want to ask you this one. It's a story that's developing this afternoon, and I know you are someone who does not shy away from making your opinions known. So, the court, the Western Cape High Court, has decided that the suspension of the public protector is invalid. And this, of course, has been seen, as a huge and a significant move by some. But, of course, we await to hear the finality from the Constitutional Court. Your reaction on that?
It's a simple one. The chronology here of what has happened is important. At some point in time, the president was within his rights to actually suspend the public protector on the basis that a parliamentary impeachment process had already been initiated. What he then did, like he always does, is that he simply then sat on that for many, many weeks. And then suddenly, at some point in time, when this Phala Phala investigation started, it seemed to have galvanized him into action. That is a valid conclusion by the High Court that, well, actually, this was not an ordinary state of affairs. Whilst we may agree, when we may acknowledge your right to implement this particular suspension, the way in which it was executed seems to have been too coincidental with the timing of her having sent the 31 questions. And I think what this judgment is calling on us to deliberate on is whether there can be a point in time where those particular powers that the president enjoys may themselves need to actually be looked at in a different way, particularly if the president is to be implicated in a particular investigation that is being undertaken by the person that he has the power to suspend. We do remember in 2016, when it related to the State Capture Commission, the former public protector said, look, in relation to what I'm investigating and what I'm recommending, I believe that the president of the country, as he was at that point in time, Mr. Zuma, may be an implicated person. So I do not think that it is appropriate for him to then cherry pick who must be the person that oversees that investigation. And our courts agreed with her reasoning in that, well, whilst the powers to actually appoint the head of a commission may constitutionally reside with the president, in an instance where he himself may have an interest in the identity of who heads up that commission, it is probably inappropriate for him to be given unilateral access to those powers. And I think what this judgment of today is seeking to do, it's seeking to explore the same territory. Now, whether this will stand up to scrutiny as it gets validated or rejected by the Constitutional Court is something that we have to wait for. But the president is fully to blame for how this has turned out, because had he pulled the trigger, suspended the public protector long before Phala Phala happened, then this wouldn't have materialized. But true to form, he tends to delay things for far too long. He tends to apply his minds to things that have already been concluded. And then it is in that lethargy, in that inability to make critical decisions that he has ended up with this High Court decision.
All right. Thank you so much, Khaya, for your time this afternoon. Do appreciate it. That is Khaya Sithole, accountant, academic and activist.